It is my really great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Adrian Dannatt. Adrian is an occasional actor, writer, curator, editor, and artist based between New York, Paris, and London. A longtime New York correspondent for the art newspaper, he was also the editor-at-large of the literary arts journal Open City and contributing editor to Lacanian Inc. His books include the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, published by Phaidon, Wim de Loive, Yale University Press, and most recently, Francois-Xavier and Claude Lalanne in the Domain of Dreams, published by Rizzoli. His fiction and poetry have been published in a range of anthologies, including Best British Short Stories and PEN New Poetry. He has organized exhibitions at varied venues, from Robert Indiana at Frank Lloyd Wright's Price Tower in Oklahoma, to shows at Castillo Corrales in Paris, and in Casman Gallery and Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York. He was a participant at the British Pavilion of the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2010. The large-scale exhibition Impasse Ronsin, Murder, Love, and Art in the Heart of Paris, that he curated for the Museum Tinguely in Basel, was held over this past summer. His own work as an artist has been exhibited at Deitch Projects, the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester, and Chanenai in Paris. And his latest book is Doomed and Famous, published by Sequence Press, which was celebrated with an exhibition he curated of the same name at Miguel Abreu Gallery in New York in early 2021. And following today's talk, Adrian will be available in our museum bookshop to sign copies of both Francois-Xavier and Claude Lalanne in the Domain of Dreams, as well as Doomed and Famous. And now please join me in welcoming Adrian, who will speak to us on this amazing Bohemian Luxe. Adrian.
Hello. Well, wait. I wanted to thank Kathleen, obviously, for a very fulsome introduction, marvelous, slightly shaming, but somewhat true. And I particularly wanted to thank her for the wonderful exhibition, which I hope everybody here has had a chance to see right when you come into the Clark in the entrance. I think it's really an exceptional exhibition. I've been involved with a lot of Lalanne exhibitions over the years, visiting them, also helping curate them. And I think this is actually one of the most elegant, one of the most beautifully put together that I've seen. I really think it actually gives people a sense of Lalanne, which probably a larger exhibition, they more likely to get lost in. And this is really like the most perfect introduction to their work. And curiously enough, a friend of mine from New York, who was mentioned earlier, Miguel Abreu, who is a contemporary art gallerist, came up and saw the exhibition and was completely changed his view of Lalanne due to Kathleen's exhibition. And said, I'm converted, well, not quite converted, almost converted to Le Lalanne by seeing this. It's the most impeccable exhibition. And I think it has to be said that there is an enormous amount of resistance to Le Lalanne in the strictly contemporary art world. And I have been mocked and teased for my interest in them and my work with them by many people who really have a kind of sort of look down on them with a sort of curious disdain, which has been there right from the beginning of their careers, which is what is very interesting. From 1964, the first show, that has been there. And what I think is so odd about this is because it's actually in a contemporary art world where really anything goes. There are no limits, except for some reason, Lalanne's work sparks a kind of resistance to people. And in fact, Miguel Abreu, who came here, is organizing a show with one of his artists, with the curator here, who is an artist who I love, I should say that to begin with, Yuji Agamatsu, but who goes round New York collecting old bits of rubbish and debris, the smallest bits of rubbish he can find in the gutters of New York, bits of old chewing gum with hairs stuck on them, old cigarette butts, everything. And then he puts them in the little cellophane packet that you use on a cigarette packet. I mean, it's marvelous work, but it's curious that there's no resistance to that as cutting contemporary art, a little package of old rubbish. Whereas if you're sculpting a beautiful gold apple, or if you're making an incredible fish, that is somehow looked down upon in some kind of way. And I have to admit, which is something which I've never actually said before when speaking about them, that I myself was rather suspicious of Les Lalanne and of their work when I first saw it. When I was first asked to become involved with them, which was back in around, I suppose, 2005, 2006, I really wasn't quite sure what I made of it. I mean, my own background was I have a very a stern modernist architect father who collected abstract modern art, and he wasn't quite a brutalist, but he was certainly a functionalist, and would have loved this building that we're in right now, this 1972 building. And the strange thing was I suddenly realized that I'd seen a show by Les Lalanne back in 1976 at the Whitechapel Art Gallery. It was a very interesting venue because it was a cutting edge, always has been very much a cutting edge art gallery in Whitechapel in the East End of London. And Les Lalanne did a show there in 1976, which I saw as a teenager. I must have been about 13, I suppose. And I was just beginning to be a teenage rebel. And part of my love for this show, which I'd actually completely forgotten about for 20 years or so, part of my love of it was that my father was so horrified by this exhibition, looking at this work, and said, "Oh, well, rubbish, we have to go," And of course, immediately that appealed to me because of his instinctive loathing of this work. And actually, it's quite funny because my father had a whole relationship to the Whitechapel. This is diversion, but he had a whole relationship to the Whitechapel because he'd designed a very famous 1958 Jackson Pollock show at the Whitechapel, which was very stern, concrete breeze block design, and which Brian Robertson, who was a famous curator of the show and very camp, marvelously camp man. And Brian Robertson said, "Well, it's all very nice, this breeze block concrete, but then we're going to have these beautiful fabrics draped above, and we're going to throw spangles up. We'll have gold and silver spangles all over the ceiling," at which my father said, "Over my dead body. I'll be leaving if that happens." So I also had an instinctively suspicious reaction when years later I was first looking at their work. It wasn't anything that I was used to from my own background. I'd also been working as a curator and a critic, very much involved with conceptual art, with the conceptual art of my contemporaries, really. And so this work really came as something of a shock to me. And I could almost quote that wonderful work by Marion Moore, which is called Poetry, which begins, "I too dislike it," which I think is a marvelous opening for a poem called Poetry. And I too did sort of dislike it. I wasn't really sure. And what it reminded me of, very oddly, was of the first Jeff Koons show that I'd seen, which was in 1986 at Sonnabend in New York, which was very kitsch, silvered sculptures. And when I'd seen that, I'd been totally shocked by this, in actually a very similar way to when I was looking at Lalanne. And I kept telling people how awful this exhibition by Jeff Koons was. And the more I went on and on about the dreadfulness of this exhibition and how much I hated it, I just couldn't believe it, I slowly realized that, in fact, I was kind of obsessed with it. And I had this weird interest in it, initially of resistance. And then slowly it took over. And it was a very similar thing with the Lalanne, that when I was asked to be involved, to go and visit them, to interview them, through various connections to other things that they're involved with, which we'll talk about. And I wasn't really quite sure, but I've actually become probably, you know, one of their most, next to Kathleen, perhaps one of their most devoted fans. You know, I'm a tremendous fan. Actually, hold on, I was meant to have some notes, but, and the interesting thing is that when he began, Francois-Xavier and Claude, when Francois-Xavier began, he was actually a painter who won the first prize as a very young man at the Académie Julian, which was a very important art school in Paris. He was a modernist, semi-abstracted painter, and he was also working, finding employment as a draftsman, as an architectural draftsman for a Corbusier disciple who worked with Corbusier, called André Sive. And this were, oh, now hold on, I can show you a picture, that's exciting. Hold on. So it was funny because this was actually very much what my father loved. My father was obsessed with Corbusier and loved the idea of both being a painter and a draftsman, which, you know, let me try and get this to work, hold on. Aha! I knew this would never work. Maybe I'm pointing it the wrong way around. Oh, I've gone too fast. Right, so there he is. That's Francois-Xavier at work doing one of his paintings, which are beautiful, and which he had a first show of, which was actually very successful. And then he really actually completely gave up doing painting, but later in life, he did a beautiful series of etchings, and he continued to draw. There was a big difference between his work and that of his wife, Claude, was that she really made things by hand, very much you know, by the feel and by the touch of them, whereas Francois-Xavier, with his training as an architectural draftsman and as a painter, always actually drew everything that he was going to make meticulously, I mean, incredible detail. This is a lovely, lovely work from the 70s. Let me just see what I was actually meant to be talking about rather than rambling on. Yeah, so now we can get on to, yes. So yeah, he was working as a draftsman, and then he actually carried on, oh my God, it's doing it by itself. Yeah, so he actually carried on working, Francois-Xavier carried on working, doing projects with a lot of architects, amazing big scale things. This is in a housing estate outside Paris, La Grande Borne, in the 1980s, I think. And this is an aspect that actually I think is so interesting that people don't think about, because they think of the work more as domestic scale, partly because of what Claude made, which were always smaller things. People think of them as more of a kind of domestic objects, jewelry, small-scale sculpture, but in fact they were involved in a lot of very big and very impressive architectural projects. This is also at the housing estate. And I think this is interesting. I actually showed this work to my father because his reaction when I first explained I was writing about it, he asked me, "What are you doing at the moment?" And I explained and showed this. And he reacted with suitable horror. And he called them a decorative bibelot for a decadent jet set. Those were his words, a decadent bibelot, which in fact, I mean, he didn't even know who their clients were and who their collectors were. But that was strangely really the view of them for a long time, even within the Paris art world. But while they were living at the time in the Impasse Ronsin, which, as Kathleen mentioned, I just did a big exhibition on, which was a little cul-de-sac in Montparnasse, where for about 100 years, from 1870 until 1970, an incredible array of artists, sculptors, a lot of sculptors were based there. The most famous of whom, who moved in 1916 and was there till the end of his life, was Constantin Brancusi, and who was the next door neighbor of Les Lalanne and was very close to them. They drank vodka with him, they ate with him, he gave advice, and he was he was a friend, which was certainly not true of a lot of the other young artists who were living in the Impasse Ronsin, who Brancusi hated Max Ernst, he hated another artist, Jean Tinguely, who was there, but he actually loved Claude and Francois-Xavier. And this is a photograph taken by Francois-Xavier's brother, who was a photographer of Francois-Xavier on the right, obviously, and Brancusi on the left. And I think, and he had to do it in a very clandestine way, this photograph, because Brancusi had very much a Romanian kind of peasant's idea that the photograph stole your soul. And although he staged many photographs for himself, Brancusi, and took endless photographs of his work, he was very opposed to anyone else taking his photographs. And even though it's kind of clandestine, it really gets a sense of the camaraderie between the Lalannes and the Brancusi. And, they were surrounded by, this is the Impasse Ronsin. This is an old postcard of the view of the entrance, where there were, as I said, an incredible array of different artists working. It was unbelievably cheap, and it was also unbelievably rough. There was basically one lavatory. It was a little bit like being in the countryside in the middle of Paris, but it was pretty poor living conditions. There wasn't really any heating. It was very rudimentary indeed. There's a wonderful photograph with a cat, as you may notice, for people on the internet, because they like cats. And that's one of the letter boxes, obviously with Brancusi and with Istrati and Dumitrescu, who became his heirs, who were also two Romanian artists who were based next to him. And there's and there is a plan of it where you get a little bit of a sense of this kind of ramshackle place where they all lived, where you can see the Atelier Lalanne up there, and Brancusi's ateliers, which kept getting bigger and bigger. So he moved there in 1916, he kept taking over more and more space. And in the end, he had a huge studio, which you can see outside the Pompidou Center. When they removed it, when the Impasse was being knocked down, they took it to the Pompidou Center. So you can see Lalanne, and you can see Del Debbio on the left, which is interesting. It was a man called André Del Debbio, who was there from the 1930s onwards, and who was actually the tutor of Francois-Xavier Lalanne at the Académie Julian. And Francois-Xavier had said, do you know anywhere I can live and work? And André Del Debbio said, you know what, there is a place next door to me. And André Del Debbio was actually the very last person to be in the Impasse. He was there in 1970 when it was knocked down and turned into a hospital. You have Pollack, who is not Jackson Pollock, but Reginald Pollack, also a very interesting artist who showed with Pollock once or twice. And because of Pollack, in fact, a lot of histories of the Impasse Ronsin claim that Jackson Pollock was actually living there. And in fact, Jackson Pollock was probably the first American artist who was successful without ever leaving America. He never actually went outside of the United States. And up at the top left is quite important. You have Max Ernst, and you have William Copley. And Copley was a great collector, gallerist. He opened a surrealist gallery in Los Angeles in the 1940s, and then became a painter of his own later in life, and was also a very early collector of Lalanne, and had one of the very first black sheep, the sheep they made when he got divorced. He was given a black sheep to celebrate his divorce. And so Ernst, let's see, who else we have? Well, there also equally important is we have the atelier of Jean Tinguely, the Swiss artist, who lived there with his first wife, Eva Aptley, and then when he remarried to Niki de Saint-Phal, the sculptor, she also lived there. So they were, and these people were very much amongst the very close friends of Lalanne. So they had Brancusi kind of in the middle, both literally and metaphorically, this revered great artist. And then they had these young, very radical artists surrounding them who they collaborated with and who they were inspired by. And in fact, it was Jean Tinguely and Niki de Saint-Phal who first said to him, said to both the Lalannes, you've really got to become artists for yourself, because at that point, they weren't really making work as artists. Francois-Xavier had got stuck with his painting. Claude Lalanne was there. I should say that they had met because Claude's husband at the time, they met in 1952 at the first ever exhibition of Francois-Xavier's paintings, which actually turned out to be the last exhibition of his paintings also. And Claude's husband worked for the same architectural firm. She was married, she had 3 daughters. And Francois-Xavier was also married at the time to a fashion model who worked for Dior. And it was very much Tinguely and Niki de Saint-Phalle who said, you've got to become artists, because they were living there at the Impasse Ronsin, but they weren't really making art. What they were doing was they were working for fashion designers and for shops and for theatrical spectacles. They worked with Maurice Béjart, the great choreographer. They were doing sets, they were doing props, they were doing all those kind of things. And they were also working for, I'm not quite sure what this picture. Oh yeah, well, there's a lovely picture of Francois-Xavier with his daughter from his first wife, Dorothy, in the Impasse Ronsin, where you can have a little sense of just how rough and, you know, relatively poor it was. So they were working, yeah, as I said, they were working doing sets, they were doing window dressing, and they were working with Christian Dior, and who was in the last decade of his life or so. And they worked closely with Dior, which again is very much looked down on in the contemporary art world. I mean, the fashion world, and especially haute couture, is very badly regarded by the contemporary art world. But, you know, there's an exhibition right on at the moment at the Brooklyn Museum on Christian Dior, which was previously in Paris at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, which was a big blockbuster show. And you realize just what an amazing figure Dior was, what an amazing designer, but also he was an artist himself. He was a draftsman who actually lived as a young man by selling his drawings. He opened his own gallery. There was a Christian Dior gallery in the 1930s before he became a designer, and he worked with Picasso, he showed Picasso. And so really, when you think about someone like Dior, it's so remarkable that the Lalannes worked with him from the 1950s right through when they met his young genius protege who took over, Yves Saint Laurent, who of course became, with Pierre Berger, 2 of the major supporters and collectors of Les Lalanne. So they knew Christian Dior himself, because actually Francois-Xavier's first wife as a model worked a lot for Dior, so there was a direct connection with Dior. And then, of course, they carried on working with Yves Saint Laurent. And then, rather marvelously, in 2017, the new director of Dior, Maria Grazia Chiori, asked Claude Lalanne to do a new set of jewelry for a catwalk show, for the first Dior catwalk show that Chiori organized. And at that time, Claude, it was 2 years before her death, so she was like 93 or something. And so you have this amazing collaboration with someone like Dior, however badly the contemporary art world may think of it. It's a collaboration with this man that lasts, in Claude's case, that's almost 70 years. I mean, it's really quite an extraordinary thing with the House of Dior. Yes, and so there was also, you know, Max Ernst, who you saw his studio in the in the map of the Impasse. That's a picture of Max Ernst, much older than when they knew him, with Claude in one of her crocodile chairs at Uri, the house that they moved to later. And I think it's important to stress that they were really so closely connected to these artists, to the young artists like Tinguely and Niki de Saint-Phalle, but also to Brancusi and to Max Ernst, not least through their gallerist, which we'll get on to. Yeah, wonderful picture. I mean, look at the delight on his face looking at this extraordinary thing. And later in life, Francois-Xavier actually did an homage, to 2 of these key artists, to Ernst and to Brancusi, which is called La Génie de Bellerive, which is a sketch for it. You can see it's kind of the way he sketches things out, and he does these measured drawings. And there's a photo up there. Well, actually, that's not of it. But you see in the next one, this is at the Fairchild Botanic Garden in Florida. And basically, it's a kind of Brancusi column with a Max Ernst owl at the top of it. And that was much later in his life. Francois-Xavier created this really to pay homage to these two figures who they'd known and who they had, well, not collaborated with, but had known and as close friends. And as Kathleen puts in her exceptional essays in her book, in her catalog, which I hope you all have, no doubt, it's in a way, it's quite funny because Francois-Xavier has put Ernst on top of Brancusi, almost as if looking down on Brancusi. And Brancusi hated Ernst. He thought he was far too tall, and he didn't like the way he was so good looking also. He found that very annoying. Oh, and yes, so at the Impasse Ronsin, we're still stuck there, I'm afraid. It was going from 1870 until 1970. So there were a lot of North American, Canadian, as well as North American artists who went there and were based in the Impasse Ronsin at the late 19th century. And probably two of the most, interestingly enough, I think two of the most famous before Brancusi moved there were both American animalier sculptors, sculptors who worked with animal forms, one of whom was Eli Harvey, who was a Quaker and who was adored by Teddy Roosevelt, the president, who had his elk. He made a very famous elk, the Eli Harvey elk, and that was always on the White House desk of Teddy Roosevelt. And the other was Alexander Phimister Proctor, a wonderful artist. And these are the pumas which guard the entrance to Prospect Park in Brooklyn, where I often pedal past and salute them admiringly. And these were actually, the models of these were actually made in Paris at the Impasse Ronsin. So it's rather wonderful to think of these late 19th century animalier sculptors who the Lalannes, they weren't even aware of them. I remember talking to them about them. They weren't aware that they'd been living there, but they continued this tradition. I mean, almost single-handedly or double-handedly. They carried on the animalier tradition into the 21st century, the Lalannes. And this is one of the early works, very early work that we're lucky enough to have here in the exhibition by Claude, which is from 1964. So what really happened was they were told to start making their own work, and then Tanguy said, we'll help get you a gallery, we'll find you a gallery. And they ended up having their first show in 1964 at Gallery J, which was for Janine de Goldschmidt, who was the wife of Pierre Restagny, who was a hugely important curator who launched the Nouveau Realisme. And so, we have to remember that they're right in the heart of the most avant-garde Parisian art scene, the latest contemporary art scene in Paris. They're best friends with Tanguy and with Niki de Saint-Phalle. They're showing at Galerie J. And that show was a great success. And thanks to that show, they were taken up by one of the most important gallerists of the time, which is Alexandre Yolas, who is, oddly enough, almost forgotten today, which is really quite bizarre. I mean, he was like the Gagosian. He was the first Gagosian, really, who had galleries all over the world. He had 5, 6 galleries all over the world at different times. Hugely important art dealer. And when he took on Les Lalanne, he said, well, my dears, from now on, you have nothing to worry about. No one will steal from you apart from me. This will just be me stealing from you from now on. Mes chéris. He was a wonderful man. It's interesting that they were with him because he very much was a dealer in late surrealism, tardif surrealism. And he really made the careers of Max Ernst and Magritte, most importantly Magritte, many other people. But both Magritte and Max Ernst were famous before the war, famous in the art world, really. But they were essentially poor artists. They weren't really internationally known figures. And Alexandre Yolas totally transformed their careers. Not necessarily in the most ethical of ways. I mean, he basically told them what to do and what to make. So there are incredible lists in the archives. There are lists of what he sends to Magritte of what needs to be produced. We don't want any of that. We want 5 more of these. which actually was more common than people think in the art world. You know, gallerists would tell people what to do. So they should. And Eolus, Eolus also took up, I mean, he really was an extraordinary figure, and he took up Ed Ruscha, for example, because Ed Ruscha did the cover of Art Forum. He designed a surrealism issue of Art Forum in 1966. And the next year, Eolus took him on because he loved that connection with surrealism. And actually, I did an exhibition and a book also on Alexander Eolus, and Ed Ruscha was so excited to be able to talk about him. I mean, I could speak for hours, which I won't, about him. Hello? Oh, yes. Yeah, so for example, amongst these, you know, the throbbing avant-garde that the Lalannes were part of was Daniel Spoerry, a very interesting Swiss experimental artist, who got them to, you know, take part in these cannibal dinners, in these performances. And, you know, this is a different way of thinking about the Lalanne. You know, there are different ways of approach. You think about them as architects doing these projects, and you think about them as very much part of the performance art scene of, you know, of what you would call avant-garde, the young avant-garde art, rather than, you know, dinky decorators. There's a lovely picture of Claude with Jean Tinguely in the Impasse, talking away in these marvelous high heels. And that's a drawing of one of them, wonderful thing by Francois-Xavier, which is the Cocodole bed. And this is a drawing by William Copley, who I showed you. He had a little studio there at the Impasse Ronsin, the American artist, who did a drawing of it. I think we should say that, oh yeah, this is the cover of their first exhibition at the Galerie J at Janine de Goldschmidt's gallery. Wonderful rhinoceros by Francois-Xavier. And the text for this was by a fascinating character called James Metcalf, Jimmy Metcalf, who was an American artist who had worked with his parents, who were both stained glass artists and did a lot of work in churches. As a teenager, he worked with his parents. And then he joined the American army at the beginning of the Second World War. And when he was asked to put down his occupation, he wrote sculptor, because that's what he was. And then at the Battle of Anzio, he was a great war hero. And at the Battle of Anzio, he had 3 fingers blown off his hand in the opening moments of the battle. And of course, because of that, because he was registered as a sculptor, he got this marvelous money from the American government for the rest of his life, which he basically lived on, because they thought he would have lost his occupation. But he carried on very much as a sculptor, and he was an incredible technical expert on metalwork, on different forms of metalwork. And he'd studied at the Central School in London with a metal worker who had worked for the Emperor Franz Ferdinand, I think. I mean, some extraordinary lineage, one of the great Central European metal workers. So he knew everything. And he really, when he lived in the Impasse Ronsin, he taught a lot of people the technical ways of making things. Most especially, he taught Claude how to do this galvanoplasty technique of dipping things in copper to galvanize them. And he was a very intriguing figure because of his the central school where he studied was very influenced by ideas of Ruskin and by William Morris, and by the idea of the craftsman and the artisan, which became a very important idea to Les Lalanne as well. But I mean, Metcalf was really kind of a communist with a small c. He was totally opposed to the star art system and the idea of, you know, the individual star figure. He really believed in a medieval, a kind of fantasy, perhaps, of the anonymous medieval artisan. And he moved to Mexico, and he single-handedly revived the copper practice in this small town called Santa Clara del Cobre, which had been known for its copper making for centuries, but which had completely died out. And he revived it, working with the people there, very much as a communal effort. And they made the torch for the 1968 Olympics when they were held in Mexico City. And in fact, Miguel Abreu, not wanting to devote my whole talk to Miguel, but Miguel Abreu gave a show to James Metcalf because, of course, in the contemporary art world, someone like Metcalfe is much more acceptable, mainly because he was opposed to the notion of the wealthy, glamorous patron. He was actively opposed to the idea of the star art system, which makes him a very interesting figure. And in fact, Jimmy Metcalfe's son, Darius Metcalfe, is married to Claude's granddaughter, Julie, and they live in France, and they actually make a lot of the work, especially the late work. A great deal of it was made by Jimmy Metcalfe's son with Claude's granddaughter, which is a very nice kind of continuity, I would say. And I think we meaning I, should also say that, that notion of the small c communist, the Lalannes were written about from this show. This show got a huge amount of attention, and then vastly more with the second show, which was Alexander Jolas. They really became kind of stars, not quite like Byron overnight, but practically. But they were written about by many of the leading critics of the time in a whole series of left-wing intellectuals, anarchist intellectuals like Michel Argan and Pierre Berger, who was the partner in business and in life with Yves Saint Laurent, wrote about their first show for Combat, which was a Marxist, well, if not actually almost practically a Stalinist publication at the time. And they had, and they also worked very closely with these architects whose projects we saw, Émile Ayot, who was a great friend of theirs, and Paul Chermatov, who were both paid up members of the French Communist Party. And Paul Chermatov actually designed the famous Communist Party headquarters in Paris, along with Oscar Niemeyer. They collaborated on that. So I always love to have a fantasy version of the Lalannes, like a science fiction parallel universe in which they were dedicated communists and would only make work to support the French Communist Party and would refuse to sell to anyone outside of strict communist circles, and how totally different they would be seen and how their work would be seen in this kind of fantasy, a bit like Jimmy Metcalfe, who did actually go on to do that. 1964. And then the next show at Alexander Jolas is in 1966. And this is, it's funny that they're famous, Les Lalannes, sort of in France, especially in certain parts of France, certain circles, they're very well known. But outside of France, in the Anglo-Saxon world, they're really much less known. And I endlessly have to try and say to people, who they are and explain who they are. And usually the simplest way of doing it is saying that they made the sheep, that they made the mouton, which of course immediately brings up the thing that they didn't make anything together. Well, in fact, they made two collaborations. There are only really two, or maybe Kathleen will probably correct me, maybe a few more, but around two actual collaborations. So they lived together, they worked in separate studios, and they made completely different work. And yet they insisted on being known as Les Lalannes. And in fact, they called the works that they made Lalannes as objects. And Les Lalannes, which doesn't make any sense in French, it's against French grammatical rules, has been very much read as a kind of proto-feminist gesture, maybe, in that they were combined, Francois-Xavier and Claude were combined as one entity, which is very odd as they didn't actually collaborate. And it's almost like they today, it could be almost like a sort of gender neutral they. But I think it's also, in a way, got that notion of being a guild, of a sort of medieval guild. Again, getting back to the Jim Metcalfe fantasy of a sort of anonymous artisan. There's a sort of the notion of the anonymous artisanal guild in Les. Anyway, these famous sheep were made by Francois-Xavier and first shown in beginning of 1966 at actually another politically radical hotbed, which was the Salon de la Jeune Peinture in Paris, where he produced these, and they were shown in a massed way, very similar to this. This is at their apartment when they were forced to leave the Impasse Ronsin, before it was torn down, and they moved to another impasse very nearby. And this is an extraordinary thing showing just the kind of massing of these works. So rather than individual pieces of furniture, luxury furniture, they're almost like, I mean, there's definitely an installation. And that's very much how they were shown at the Salon de la Jeune Peinture the first time, and actually photographed with a lot of young, radical, proto-May 68 artists all sitting on top of them, the fellow artists all sitting on top of these sheep. But these, yes, and they were called pour Polythème. They were titled by Francois-Xavier, because Francois-Xavier was educated by the Jesuits and was a great scholar of ancient Greek and of Latin, but had a very strong interest in the classical ancient world. And really there's a sort of pre-Christian, even though he was educated by Jesuits, there's a sort of pre-Christian, almost close, I would say almost close to animal worship, the sort of element in Francois-Xavier's work. And he worked at the Louvre guarding this famous bull, where apparently he must have spent about a year working as a security guard at the Louvre. And he particularly had to look after this, where women like to pee behind it for some reason. And he claimed, Francois-Xavier claimed that he'd even slept on the back of this. So he had this classical education, which is why he called the sheep pour Polythème, and Polythème is the character in the Odyssey who is the one-eyed monster who is guarding the cave and who checks, when Odysseus is trying to escape, checks the top of the sheep as they're leaving the cave to make sure no one's trying to get out. And in fact, cunning Odysseus and his team are underneath, are strapped under the sheep, so escape past Polythème. And I have to say that one of my great regrets is that I was once at their house, I was talking with Le Lalanne and talking about how the way that their work had infiltrated the contemporary art world, had slowly but steadily worked its way into the contemporary art world, reminded me most of all of a Trojan horse. And then suddenly we had a kind of eureka moment, and Francois-Xavier said, "Trojan horse, oh my God, it's a perfect work, you know, and this would be an ideal work." And we had this kind of fantasy, only sadly discussed, that Claude could then make something that would be hidden within the Trojan horse. But she couldn't think of what to come up with. She couldn't really do soldiers or things. So it would have to be something that was buried in a very smooth Trojan horse as created by Francois-Xavier. Anyway, another failed dream that never came to be. And yes, still talking about the mouton and the surrealist connection of Le Lalanne, not least with Alexander Jolas. Actually, Claude had worked with Salvador Dali, creating a set of cutlery for him, fantastic photograph of this cutlery that she created, that she made versions of throughout the rest of her life, in which there's a very beautiful version here in the exhibition. And so she knew Dali, and in fact, Dali commissioned a kind of onion watch from her also, and very much liked their work. And there is of course, it's a funny thing that they knew Duchamp also. And in fact, when Francois-Xavier Lalanne did one of his first rhinoceroses, he did as a rhinoceros bath, which is a fantastic thing. It's a bright blue rhinoceros, which opens up and has a bath and has washing stuff in it, you know, a sink and everything else. And that was actually bought by Tini Duchamp, who was the widow of Marcel Duchamp and lived around the corner from them in the country in Uri. So it's funny that they knew Duchamp and they also knew Dali. In fact, there was a very nice show at the Royal Academy in London recently on Duchamp and Dali and on the friendship between these two and why one should be so looked down on in the contemporary art world. Dali is rather frowned on, and the other one should be really, you know, such a huge figure and such a star. And curiously, again, the technically gifted one, Salvador Dali, being the one who's rather looked down on. But then the curious thing is that Dali actually did well, there's actually a drawing by, she didn't do so many drawings, Claude, but this is a drawing she did for the Paris Review in 1970, which includes her table set, her silverware, is that the word? Maybe. her silverware, which she'd already designed, but this is a 1970 sketch of it. But as I was saying, Dali, curiously enough, with whom there are many connections with their work, had actually produced a drawing in 1942, a project for a library that you can see a version of on the right, which featured sheep as furniture. And there's another version of this where you actually see people lying, sleeping on the top of these sheep, which have on the bottom, actually have wheels, just like the Lalanne sheep. And this is a curious thing. I mean, one assumes it's just a coincidence, but of course one never knows. They did know Dali as a friend. And on the left is an odd thing. This is actually an edition, a recent edition that has been made in Europe of the Dali sheep because of the huge success of the Lalanne sheep. You can get knockoff versions of the Lalanne sheep in almost any design shop. There are an enormous amount of them. And so people actually decided to put out a limited edition version of the Dali sheep. Anyway, it's just a curious thing to show how it comes out of a late Surrealist project, Francois-Xavier's work, but also that, you know, I mean, who knows, possibly he was influenced by having seen this. And again, this is an example of a lot of the great coverage that they got. This is one of his rhinoceroses, which is parked outside the street, which of course got a huge amount of attention. You know, people couldn't drive past it without photographing it. And so essentially, you know, they were now showing with Alexander Jolas, who had been told by the other artists in the gallery, you can't work with Lalanne, Les Lalanne, you know, they're decorative artists, they're not artists. You just can't do this. To which he replied, honestly, I just couldn't care less. You know, he had a marvelous approach. It meant nothing to him whatsoever. But, you know, this is when the trouble begins for Les Lalanne. They don't move to Mexico as committed communists. They start gathering an incredible array of the richest people in the world, basically, who become their devoted collectors. Not least of all, relatively early collectors, Gianni Agnelli and the Agnelli family, who love the pun of Agnelli because, of course, it means lamb, the plural of lambs. So they thought this was so funny. And of course, Francois-Xavier particularly loved that because a lot of his work was actually based on wordplay, on puns, and he loved language and he wrote poetry. And as I mentioned, he had this classical education, Jesuit education. So he was very committed to literature and to language. So he loved the fact Agnelli bought this as a kind of joke because of their name. And here you can see a somewhat major Roy Lichtenstein and a Francis Bacon in the background and a great Kenneth Nolan. So you're talking about really some of the major collectors in the world, not least of all the de Menil family and the Schlumberger family, who are related and who, again, through Alexander Jolas, were not only phenomenally rich, but were also very dedicated collectors, especially of Surrealism, and opening the de Menil Foundation. And they were great supporters of Lalanne also. Jolas's show traveled the next year to the Art Institute of Chicago in 1967, which was basically the same show with some differences and a very different kind of layout. Amazing the way that the sheep are laid out there, this curious configuration of the sheep. You know, so that this is their third show they've ever done. They've done a small show with Galerie G. They've been with Jolas, and then the Jolas show goes to the Art Institute of Chicago. It's the third exhibition they've ever done. And this is in Life magazine. It gets a whole, you know, several page article in Life magazine. So essentially they're having huge success, or really a kind of immediate success. And quite rightly, because it's fabulous stuff, as I now think. And they didn't actually have another museum show in America for another 10 years until 1977 in Texas. And then 30 years later, 40 years later, here. So that's kind of weird, right? So they've got a museum exhibition, which is their third show, and then really another 40 years before having an American museum show. Now, of course, this is the young man that they'd met when they were working with Christian Dior, the genius, the quiet, shy genius, Yves Saint Laurent, who became one of Claude's closest friends and who she collaborated with on all sorts of things. She did breastplates. She did for catwalk shows. He dressed her, actually. He would make outfits for her personally, which he did for really absolutely nobody. And she would cut them up. He made a famous shirt for her, which she then cut off the sleeves to his absolute shock. But they could do no wrong. Les Lalanne could do no wrong as far as Yves Saint Laurent was concerned. This I found in their bathroom when I was doing my book for Rizzoli. This was in their bathroom at their house in Uri, tucked behind frame, but tucked behind these books. And, you know, it just shows this, you know, the strong bond. What a lovely thing, you know, with the Marrakesh there, 1969. And then what I love is along the side, it says Pierre aussi, that's Pierre Berger, Yves' partner. And, you know, there was a very close relationship. And as we're supposedly, why do I keep saying that? It's like Les Lalanne, we, meaning I, supposedly tracking the transformation in their fortunes from, you know, the woodpile of Brancusi to their current glory, it would have to be said that Yves Saint Laurent and Pierre Berger were also crucial to the change in the perception of Lalanne because of the sale of their work. When there was a giant sale at Christie's in Paris of their collection, suddenly the works by Claude and Francois-Xavier went for enormous sums of money, especially a hall of mirrors, a sort of nod to Versailles, hall of mirrors for the Salon de Musique in the famous Pierre Berger and Yves Saint Laurent apartment on the Rue Babylone in Paris. She had created 15 mirrors there, which sold for, well, one shouldn't mention vulgar figures in a museum. It's very looked down on putting figures, but everybody loves them really, don't they? That's the funny thing. I think it was like 2.5 million euros for this set of 15 mirrors. And nowadays, one of those mirrors would probably go for 2.5 million. So this sale really changed everything. And just before that, sadly, Francois-Xavier missed the sale. He died the year before. And this sale really shifted everything, especially at that time, two dealers started working with them, Ben Brown in London and Hong Kong, and Paul Casmin, the late, sadly late Paul Casmin in New York. And that Anglo-Saxon world hadn't really been dealt with so much. It had been very much a French market for Les Lalanne. So that really shifted everything, the sale and then these young dealers becoming involved. And it really took off from there, and the prices just kept going up and up. I actually have these prices, wherever my damn notes are. I actually have these prices, which are kind of amazing. And just to break all museum protocol and taboo on such vulgarity, where are they? Because I do rather like, you know, I mean, the work had always been expensive. It hadn't, it was never, you could never snap it up at a bargain price. But yeah, so a bar that had been made for Yves Saint Laurent sold for $3.5 million made by Francois-Xavier at the auction, of the Yves Saint Laurent auction. And then a bar made for Jacques Grange, the decorator, sold for $6.2 million in 2017. And that's an awful lot of money for a bar, basically, to keep your bottles and your ice in. And that same year in 2017, Claude, one of her Bureau Crocodile, sold for $2.2 million. And she was actually the most expensive living French artist, neck and neck with Pierre Soulages, which is kind of great because they were both in their mid-90s. So you had these kind of competitive mid-90s French artists. Look at that lovely thing. That's Loulou de la Falaise, as you all know. With Yves at Uri, the beautiful house where Les Lalanne had moved to, which was a wonderful place near Fontainebleau, which Jean Tinguely had suggested that they get something in that area, and which became a kind of real center of the 1970s, swinging 1970s Paris social world, especially the fashion scene. And there's that rather marvelous bestseller called The Beautiful Fall, which is about fashion in Paris in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, and the world of Karl Lagerfeld, who was also a friend of Les Lalanne and fell out with them, actually. But Yves Saint Laurent, the entire group around these people. And I think that is a huge factor in their current success or their more recent success, is that there is a whole sort of Instagram generation of younger and genuinely young people in their 20s who have a weird obsession with that 1970s world of rather decadent glamour. I think the idea is that if you can, Jacques de Bachère, the famous gigolo playboy, all these wonderful figures, and a lot of people really want to be sort of, to have some of that glamour rub off on them. And the idea is sort of, if you buy a work by Lalanne, you sort of, you're sitting on a mouton and sipping mouton with a real Rothschild, next to you in 1973 in this beautiful house in the country. And there's a sort of aspirational, deliciously aspirational aspect to that whole thing of wanting to recapture the past in this work. This is the fabulous Salon de Musique in the Rue de Babylone apartment of Yves Saint Laurent, where, as I said, these things broke all records and are really amongst, I think, some of the most marvelous things that she did, that Claude created. And again, this is a housing project because they went on with the backing, this is one of the earlier housing projects, but they went on to do these big things. That's a scheme that Francois-Xavier did, a wonderful unrealized scheme to actually build a house that would be a head, where you would have the bedrooms up in the top. It would be a giant head on the seashore, and which there is a kind of fantasy that this might actually come to be at some point, perhaps with the backing of some of their tame billionaires. This is a wonderful thing that Claude did at Les Halles, which was a garden for children, with her topiary work. And likewise, this is at the Lycée Français in Los Angeles, where they built these wonderful elephants here. And, probably, I'm almost convinced of it, an influence on Jeff Koons, who went on to build these animal sculpture figures, which was a very similar idea, building topiary around these figures. And that's in Santa Monica on the boulevard, in the shopping boulevard in Santa Monica. And I should also say that one of the other key figures in the very recent world domination of Lalanne is Peter Marino, the architect, who became a sort of obsessive fan of theirs and was very, very friendly, especially with Claude, and who insisted, not only collected a lot of their work himself, but insisted that his clients have work. He works as an architect and also as an interior designer, and he would always be buying things for his clients, and then insisting that, shameful to admit, in public, in luxury shopping malls around the world, not least in Asia, that they should have Lalanne work. And this is nothing to do with Peter Marino, but this is an example of their work in a retail environment, in a shopping arcade, which is exactly the sort of thing that they would say, like Alexander Jolas, honestly, we couldn't care less. They certainly had no objection to having their work seen by as many people and in any context whatsoever. And again, this is on Park Avenue, a thing that Paul Casmin organized, just to give a sense of the kind of the way that their work is really, even though they'd done housing projects and larger schemes in France, their work was really expanding out across the world with the help of these Anglo-Saxon dealers. This is one of their great, in the house, the beautiful house of one of their great late devotees, Marc Jacobs, who wrote a preface to my book, my Rizzoli book, that you'll all be buying in a minute or two. And this is Marc Jacobs' house, who absolutely loved their work, and actually who he asked Claude to do various collaborations with him. And, a lot of those converts to their work really were all the more devout, as converts often are, were all the more devout as converts to the Lalanne world. This is rather great. This is Carla Fendi, another example of a rich and powerful patron. This is this giant bear being delivered to their house, I think in Sardinia, was not invited there, but there's the bear being brought over and then installed. You can just see it through the doors. I mean, really, I could speak for hours. I won't, but I could speak for hours just showing images of rich, famous, fabulous people and their works of Lalanne all over the world. But I'm definitely not going to do that. And there is, to give a sense of them at home, there's Francois-Xavier at home. They had, as I mentioned, they had this beautiful house where everybody, which became a kind of gathering place of the beau monde of 1970s France. And it was a wonderful house, but it was a kind of compound of buildings where they kept their separate studios, where they had a lot of their sculpture in the garden. But it was incredibly elegant. It was extraordinarily elegant, but it absolutely was very far from being lavish. And I think there's a marvelous kind of fairy tale arc to those artists who are in the Impasse Ronsin. If you think of Jean Tinguely, or actually if you think about Brancusi, when he was there till he died in 1957, he was world famous. People came to visit him from America especially, but from all over the world to visit the studio. And he was enormously rich, in fact. Brancusi was incredibly wealthy. And Tinguely and Niki de Saint-Phal and Les Lalanne all went on to be extremely comfortable in their fiscal affairs and in their lifestyle. But it was all very much that quote of Picasso, I'd like to live as a poor man, but with lots of money, which is the kind of ideal way to live, as a poor person, but with lots of money. And that was very much how they lived at Uri. Very different to the Impasse Ronsin, where they really didn't have any money and lived incredibly poorly. But the sort of high point of, what have we got here? Yeah, marvelous. This is the studio, the atelier of Claude. And there you have fingers, you have, moule of the fingers, molds for the fingers. Incredible chaos and incredible amounts of work everywhere in both of their studios. This marvelous creative kind of mess everywhere. And, they carried on working right till the day they died, basically, both of them. And they both died at quite an old age. I mean, Claude was 94, I suppose, 95. But maybe that's one of the advantages of being an artist or an architect. They were essentially interested in doing the work, and they just wanted to be there, working, making this stuff, which they did. I mean, really, absolutely non-stop. And they had no interest in the supposed trappings of contemporary great wealth. They weren't interested in gleaming kitchen islands or in private jets, or but at the same time, you have to say that they knew if they wanted a private jet, it was, I can't click my left hand but finger, but in a click of the fingers they could have a private jet wherever they wanted. But that was never their concern. There is an example of the actually rather more formal one. Usually ate in the kitchen, so that's slightly more formal. That's in their house, in the dining room. But again, the high point of any visit there would be Claude's tarte tatin, which she was famous for, which was marvelous, that she would make herself. And then very nice, always some very good, several bottles of claret. They didn't object to drinking their Rothschild friends' aforementioned mouton. Aforementioned mouton. Like that, yeah. So there you get a kind of sense of it. Look at that marvelous light fixture up there. The paper, this folded piece of paper, which were often catching fire, in fact. But Claude, throughout the house, would just have these pieces of paper that she wrapped around light bulbs and made herself. She was amazingly creative. Everything she did had this extraordinary, often spontaneous, but she, they were just makers, continuous makers of these wonderful, as Kathleen says in her famous essay, these life-affirming objects that they just kept producing. And there's a wonderful crocodile that they kept. She made these fantastic crocodile benches and furniture. This never was used for one, but they always had this installed in the barn of their house in the country. And there's a rather wonderful mouton put down there. And they were very, what was nice was when you visited them, they loved to talk about the past, But what they really wanted to talk about, they certainly didn't want to talk about shopping centers in Korea. But what they actually always wanted to talk about was the Impasse Ronsin, interestingly enough, which for them had been such a mythic locale, had really been in a way the generation of all their subsequent creativity when they've been forced to become artists themselves, or they were artists themselves already, but it was that sense of the community. And actually, Francois-Xavier not only did he do the Génie de Bellerive, which is a combination of Brancusi and Ernst, he actually also did a sculpture for Brancusi, in memory of Brancusi, much later in 1984, a fountain, which I'm almost, I think, the only person in the world to have seen, because it's actually in the morgue of the hospital that took over the Impasse Ronsin. And it's basically two large, beautifully carved large stone balls with a kind of pattern around them, with a sort of fountain, but it's hidden behind the doors of the morgue, which is very odd, very odd. Brancusi's studio essentially became a morgue. And when the doors one day opened of this place, I leapt in and just managed to see this fountain before I got thrown out by the frightening hospital security staff. So I think despite the loveliness of their life at Uri, they always had this kind of secret hankering for the one lavatory and the cold and the poverty of their early days in the Impasse. And I should conclude, I don't know how long I've been droning on for, it seems forever. I should conclude that they have, as well as this exemplary exhibition here at the Clark, they also have a marvelous show on right now at Versailles in the Petit Trianon. And when I wrote the book of my obituaries, of selected obituaries that was mentioned earlier, actually it begins with Alexander Jolas, the art dealer. And Claude is one of almost the last obituaries in the book. And in my obituary, I talk of myself as a kind of courtier in the court of Lalanne. And it actually was rather like that. There were a lot of people jostling, not myself, of course, but there were quite a lot of people jostling for a kind of place within this world. And it had a sort of, in an amusing way, it had a sort of court-like structure. And so it's so marvelous that they should have this fantastic exhibition at the Petit Trianon, at the Trianon and the Petit Trianon in Versailles. And to think of Claude as a kind of course, the Trianon belonged to Marie Antoinette, and to think of Claude, who was quite regal, she was quite good at being regal and grand, but like Marie Antoinette, playing the peasant, the Impasse Ronsin peasant, beneath the grandeur of the and here is me, of all people, looking through, and I only actually just realized, looking at it now, it actually kind of looks like it might be the guillotine getting ready to, the Trianon guillotine getting ready. 1789 is looming, and I'm about to have my head chopped off. So I think I'll probably finish with me being executed, and thank you for coming. Bye. And book signing. Let's sell some books. Or not. Oh, yes, of course. Any questions? Hello. Yes, very good question. Very good question indeed. I couldn't give a figure because he made a lot. He made a great deal of them. The first time, Pour Polyphème, the first time that he showed them, as he called that installation, there were 24 of them, I think. But he went on doing different versions of them in concrete, which were for outside, the ones that were for inside seating. He did all sorts of versions. There are a few black ones, mainly white ones. I think the most successful ones are the ones that are inside. I'm less touched by the ones which are concrete, which for outside, because in a way, the whole trick of the idea has been lost, the idea that these are sheep that have come inside, have wandered inside a house. But he did produce a lot of them. But in terms of, they are hugely sought after by every sort of collector, by They are probably the most sought after, one of the most sought after things made by Lalanne, made by Francois-Xavier. And they sell for huge amounts of money. And what everybody wants, of course, are the early ones. And people want them ideally from, if you could get some from the 60s or the early 70s, that's what everybody really wants. But he did do quite a few different versions of them. I couldn't, Kathleen might be able to give you a number, but I couldn't give a possible number on how many were produced in total. But as I said, there are endless knockoffs also. Every sort of design shop and store, there are kind of versions of this idea. But it was, yeah, I mean, it was what they were really, in some ways, it was what he was most famous for, certainly, right to the end, I think. Eric Mitchell, Nathan Kernan, Sally Shafter. Yes. Alain Jouffroy, I don't know if he did. I mean, he certainly would have known them. I mean, obviously, as you know, it was a much smaller art world, so everybody really knew everybody. Alain Jouffroy, I suspect, might well have been rather snooty about them. But yeah, he certainly would have known them. I mean, they were, you know, they were big figures within a small world because it was a very tight-knit community. And I would have thought Jouffroy, actually, who was a little bit later, probably, well, I mean, he was active then also, but it probably not quite his thing. Although they were very friendly in the photograph that is of the Salon de la Jeune Peinture in 1966, when they first shown, a lot of the artists who are sitting on them were great friends of Alain Jouffroy. In fact, you might be even in the photo now, but who were very much Mai 68 artists, were revolutionary artists, mainly figurative painters, French figurative painters, who were of a kind of revolutionary bent. So he certainly would have known. I mean, Émile Laillot, the architect, who they did the Grand Beaune project with, and various other things, his son was Gilles Laillot, the painter, who certainly was close to Alain Jouffroy. Yeah.
Paul Casman's gallery when he was at Danny Mueller's place on Broadway, and he sold photos, I believe, of a small gallery of Brancusi,
Right. Yeah.
photos of Brancusi in that particular atelier.
Yes.
You didn't have to twist his arm to turn him on to Lalanne.
Oh, no,
Casman.
I didn't. I far from it. I didn't twist anybody's arm. I had
No,
my.
but you brought him to Lalanne, no?
No, completely the other way around. It was Paul Casman who twisted my little toe to get me involved with Le Lalanne. And that's when I was saying at the beginning, when I was rather shocked and taken aback by this work. Paul Casman and I were both fascinated by the Impasse Ronsin,
Yeah.
and also fascinated by Alexander Jolas. My actual first interest was in Jolas and then the Impasse Ronsin. And then really Lalanne came through that, and Paul decided to start showing Lalanne, actually through Ben Brown. Ben Brown introduced Paul to them. And then it was Paul who said, "Oh, well, you know, you should go and interview them." So no, it was very much Paul took on.
Because I just remember all of those Brancusi photos.
Absolutely.
They
Well,
were his
Paul,
pops
yeah,
photos.
Paul Casman was, you know, very much sort of began as a photo dealer. He was a photographer himself.
Right.
Was a professional photographer and was very interested in photography, especially early photography, and especially Brancusi's photography.
Yeah.
And of course, there are lots of photographs by Brancusi and of Brancusi, but as I said, he was kind of opposed. If he wasn't in complete control of the photograph, Brancusi was reluctant to pose. You know.
Hmm.
Well, thank you so much, Adrian, for this
My
great
pleasure.
talk.
My pleasure. Bye.
I want to say that Adrian's book on Le Lalanne was one of my great inspirations as I was working on this project. And we're now going to go over to the shop where that book and his Doomed and Famous book are available to be signed. Thank Thank you for coming, and thank you for those online for tuning in and for joining us.